Good afternoon. My name is Thomas Gatkins, and I'm the director of the Getty Research Institute. That's why I'm the only one having a tie in this audience. It is my pleasure to welcome all of you and to introduce our speaker this afternoon. As you know, we have organized 3 lectures and presentations in the next weeks to accompany our World War I exhibition. And we will have also a reception after the lecture. And I will especially thank the Consul General of Belgium to have sponsored the receptions for the next for all the 3 lectures. The Consul General Verstraeten will not be able to join us, but the Consul Alain Leroy will probably be part of this afternoon's lecture and also the reception. He will arrive a little later, but he will be there and you can speak to him. Well, it is a privilege to introduce our speaker, Marjorie Perloff, because not only because of her accomplishment as an academic teacher for many, many years, but also because the name sounds familiar to the GRI, because the name is often mentioned in the GRI because she is in very close relationship to some of our curators, Nancy Perloff, who has organized with 2 colleagues the World War I exhibition. Nancy, why don't you stand up so that everybody sees you, to also congratulate you for this wonderful exhibition. And she and there are 2 more curators who worked on this exhibition. Gordon Hughes, I see you, Gordon. You should stay up too. Gordon, that's Gordon, and Anja Förschner. Where's Anja? So these are the 3 curators of the exhibition, and after the lecture, you can not only talk to Professor Perloff, but also to these 3 curators if you have questions. So Professor Perloff, of course, was a professor at Stanford and also at USC, and specializing especially about the history of poetry and writing many, many books. So I don't want to ask your patience to name them all. There are more than 13. So I will just give some examples and stress or point out some major achievements. She has, of course, worked on Yeats, on Robert Lowell and Frank O'Hara, a book from poetry from Rimbaud to Cage, came out in '81. She especially is interested in the relationship of the modern movements and the relationship of poetry and art and music. There is a book about the futurist moment, avant-garde, avant-guerre, and the language of rupture in several editions. Many of her books have been translated. Another book is about the topic unoriginal genius, poetry by other means in the new century. So she's moving in her interest about poetry into the 21st century. Also, new digital poetics are in her interest, but also philosophy. Wittgenstein's Ladder, wonderful title, is one of her books, which has been translated into Portuguese and to Spanish, and will be translated into French soon. But she also is very much interested in Vienna, and there is a book, The Vienna Paradox, from 2004, then The Sound of Poetry, The Poetry of Sound, and more books. But recently, she again focused on Vienna, and her next book, this book is especially in her focus right now, and the lecture will be dealing with this, is called On the Margins of the Habsburg Empire, the Great War and the Making of Austro-Modernism. And there we enter, of course, into the topic of today and the exhibition of World War I. And this, of course, deals with these names: Kraus, Roth, Musil, Canetti, Celan, and others. Of course, Marjorie has published in TLS, Time Literary Supplement, and Washington Post, and many other famous journals. She got all the fellowships you can dream of, and she is also a member of the American Academy of Arts and Science and the Philosophical Society, and she recently became honorary foreign professor at the Beijing Modern Languages University. So not everybody can get this. And she also has an honorary degree of Bard College, which she got in 2008. So there are many reasons to join me to thank her for giving this lecture, and I hope you join me in welcoming Marjorie Perloff.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. And I'm glad you mentioned the new book from which this will be from, but I should tell you that this is quite a departure from what I usually work on, because most of this new book, and including this material on Kraus, is on theater and fiction rather than poetry. And it's much more historical and cultural than some of the things I've written. I am myself Viennese, which is why I wrote that other memoir, and that's why I got so interested in this material. But I realized that Karl Kraus is very strange. Let's start here. Here's a picture of him. Is very strange to most of you for all kinds of reasons, mainly publication problems. Kraus is very little known in the United States, in England a little more, in France a little more, but this year, because of the centennial of World War I noticed, I just realized this the other day, all kinds of things are coming out on him in Germany and Austria, of course in German, but coffee table books with titles like Der Erste Weltkrieg durch die Augen Karl Krauses and so on. Anyway, okay. And I'm going to start in medias res. There's the first scene in a recent wonderful installation done by an artist new to me named Deborah Zengel that I discovered, reading about it in the TLS that's on at Klosterneuburg, I think now, having these rats act out Act 1. But I will start with an epigraph, 2 epigraphs. My business is to pin down the age between quotation marks, Kraus said. And secondly, what has been proposed here, that is in the play, is nothing less than a drainage system for the huge swamps of phraseology. Act 1, Scene 1. The stage directions read Vienna, Ringstraße, and Sierkorner. Flags wave from the buildings, loud acclamation for soldiers marching by universal excitement. The crowd breaks up into small groups. The newsboys with their extra, I'll show you this picture first, we'll come back to it, announcing the outbreak of war are interrupted by a drunken demonstrator who shouts, "Down with Serbia, hooray for the Habsburgs, hooray for Serbia," and is immediately kicked in the pants by mistake. A crook and a prostitute exchange insults, even as 2 army contractors talking of possible bribes the rich will use to avoid the draft cite Bismarck's works in the Neue Freie Presse, which was Vienna's main newspaper at the time, like the New York Times, at the time of the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, to the effect that the Austrians deserve kissing. One officer tells another that war is unanwendbar, of no use, when he really means, as his friend points out, unabwendbar, unavoidable, unanwendbar, unavoidable. A patriotic citizen praises the coming conflict as a holy war of defense against encirclement by hostile forces, and the crowd responds by making up rhymes, and you get this scene. And I'll read it just, you have the English on the right, but I'll read it, and so therefore read the English, I'll read it through quickly in the German. Die Stimmen aus der Menge, voices from the crowd. Serbien muss sterben. So you get that silly rhyme. A jeder muss sterben. Und a jeder Russ ein Genuss. Ein Stuss, Gelächter. Anschluss. Unter jeder Franzos Aros, haha. Ein Stoß, Anstoß, so ist es. Unter jeder Tritt, na jeder Brit. Antritt, sehr gut. Ein Brit für jeden Tritt. Bravo. So we already have all these insults. Like if you see the exhibition, which I hope you all have and will, you have many things in the exhibition in the center right now that deal exactly with this kind of treatment, where the Germans are treating the French that way and so on. But here is the hatred of the others, and that's all supposed to be very funny. Now, if this dialogue, written in 1915, strikes us as cleverly mimetic of street slang, think again, for the rhymed insults to the Russians, French, and British were actually taken from a German cartoon picture postcard, August 25th, 1914, a real postcard, in which two soldiers wearing spiked helmets, here designated as Willi and Karl, are attacking the enemy. Reframed, the verses appear in what is probably the first and perhaps the most remarkable documentary drama ever written, Karl Kraus's devastating Die letzten Tage der Menschheit, The Last Days of Mankind. Kraus's dialogue, as in the scene above, sounds colloquial and nothing if not natural, representing as it does a variety of linguistic registers based on social class, ethnicity, geographic origin, and profession. But a large part of the play is drawn from actual documents, whether newspaper dispatches, editorials, public proclamations, the minutes of political meetings, or manifestos, letters, picture postcards, and interviews. Indeed, whatever constituted the written record of the World War I years. The most improbable deeds reported here, writes Karl Kraus in his preface, actually took place. The most implausible conversations in this play were spoken verbatim. The shrillest inventions are quotations. The technique is montage. Citations from Shakespeare and Goethe are interspersed with cabaret song, patriotic ode, tableau vivant, vaudeville, puppet play, and in the later acts, even photo montage, so as to create a strange hybrid, part tragedy, part operetta, part carnival, part political tract, in which high and low come together in a strange new blend. A document, as Kraus puts it, is a character. Reports rise up as living forms, while the living die as editorials. Oh, wait, I'll put that for in a minute. As editorials. The feuilleton gains a mouth and delivers its own monologue. Clichés stand on two legs. Some men are left with only one. Clichés stand on two legs. Some men were left with only one. And throughout, the comic, the hilarious, the grotesque, and the surreal dominate. In Berlin, as Kraus famously quipped, things are serious but not hopeless. In Vienna, they are hopeless but not serious. Famous sentence. In its analysis of the role the media play in disseminating the case for war, Kraus is startlingly contemporary. Turn on CNN this minute, and you find yourself witnessing the spin familiar to readers of Kraus's devastating exposures of media speak in his own famous paper, Die Fackel. And I'll come to a paper of that, Die Fackel. Actually, I thought I had it in red, but it was really red, a bright red, Die Fackel, the torch, his famous magazine that went on from 1899 to 1936. As well as in The Last Days of Mankind, a spin made possible, as Kraus knew only too well, by the simple fact, and I always think about this today, that journalists are never held responsible for the accuracy of their reports. You know, other people are held responsible for what they do, but journalists can say anything, and if it doesn't work out that way, oh well, you know, something else happens. My great example for this is Anderson Cooper. When Anderson Cooper was covering the Egyptian uprising, I think in January 2011, he couldn't say enough about the marvels of the Arab Spring, with its Facebook revolution and the ostensible thirst for democracy in Egypt, and it was just as if that was a fait accompli. Today, with the El-Sisi military dictatorship in full command, Cooper's evening dispatches almost wholly ignore the Egyptian situation. There's now ISIS and Syria to cover, as if the CNN anchor had always known the Arab Spring was doomed. How information is disseminated in a world where truth is subject to the daily news cycle. This is the condition Kraus tackled with uncanny prescience. Discussions of the early 20th century avant-garde rarely refer to the Austrian literature of the war years. Now, this is hardly surprising, given that the writers in question, from Kraus to Celan, for that matter Kafka, were not strictly speaking formal innovators. Unlike the Zaum beyond sense poetry of the Russian avant-garde, unlike the parole in libertà and destruction of syntax of Italian futurism, or the fragmentation, hyperbolic nonsense, and elaborate verbal play of Dada, both in its French and German incarnations, the Austro-Modernists in question opted for the seeming transparency of coherent sentences and normal paragraphs. They neither wrote manifestos, like Marinetti or Tzara, nor announced that they were making it new, like Ezra Pound, nor did they produce ready-mades, like Duchamp, or create abstract verbal portraits that avoided nouns and adjectives in favor of articles and function words, like Gertrude Stein. Indeed, in the case of poetry, lyric continued to prevail. Celan's minimalist poems, for example, however multiplex their language, adhere to lyric norms and rely on lineation and even stanzaic structure. But suppose we go back to the original meaning of the word avant-garde. In its inception in the 16th century, the term referred to the front flank of the army, the forerunners, those ahead of their time, whose work cannot yet be understood. Ahead of the time. In this sense, the Austrian modernists can now be seen to have produced a poetics of rupture perhaps as profound as that of their more formally radical counterparts in Italy, France, or Russia. Theirs was a world of what Karl Kraus called the unimaginable, a world of war whose purpose was never really defined and yet literally shattered their lives. And I just want to show you very quickly, I'm sorry, let me go back here. The two maps. I talk about maps in the introduction earlier of this book, but just remind yourself, for those of you who never know, look at the size of Austria-Hungary, the whole enormous thing, and all that was dissolved, and Austria was to become no more than a little, people called it the tadpole. It looks like a tadpole. That little country right there in Central Europe with Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Italy, everything removed so that their world was literally turned upside down. Rupture for the citizens of the dual monarchy was much more extreme than in Germany, which did not, after all, forfeit its basic identity. It also lost some territory, but the basic contours stayed the same as they did in France and in England. Those remained intact really until for England, after World War II, when it lost its empire, and for France, but not as extreme as that change. Just to go back for 1 minute, when you have the places way on the right, Czernowitz, where Paul Celan came to, on the far right. Let's see if I can get it here. I never know how these pointers work. Is the pointer working? No. Anyway. And all that changed completely. The unimaginable had been anticipated by Kraus as soon as the war broke out in August 1914. In Die Fackel, for 5th December 1914, the lead article was called In dieser großen Zeit. I'd show it to you the way it actually appeared in the Fackel, and then I'll read it to you in English translation. It's not as good because Kraus is a master of using repetition, so the word Zeit is repeated over and over again. In this great time, which I still remember when it was so small, which will become small again if there is enough time, and which, because in the realm of organic growth no such transformation is possible, we prefer to address as a fat time, and also a hard time. In this time, where the very thing happens that one could not imagine, and in which that must happen which one can no longer imagine, and could only imagine it, it wouldn't happen. In this serious time, which died laughing at the possibility that it could become serious, which, surprised by its tragedy, longed for distraction, and which, catching itself engaging in some new action, searches for words, in this loud time, which threatens to disclose the horrible symphony of deeds, to bring forward reports that lead to action, in this time you should not expect a single word from me. Let him who has something to say come forward and be silent. The unimaginable war is not mentioned once in this anti-manifesto, which generates mutations on the word time, Zeit, repeated here 8 times, a time that from Kraus's particular perspective was entirely out of joint. His, it should be noted, was a wholly atypical reaction to the Great War. From Rainer Rilke's patriotic Fünfgesang, 5 songs, which begins with the words, "For me, the first time I see you stand up, you legendary, most distant, unbelievable warrior god." To Hugo von Hofmannsthal's Österreichs Antwort, Austria's reply, to the initial response of Austrian writers to the outbreak of war, it was one of enthusiastic support. Even Robert Musil, later to take such a different stance, wrote in 1914, "A new feeling was born, a stunning sense of belonging tore our hearts from our hands. Now we feel gathered into a ball, fused together by an inexpressible humility, in which the individual suddenly counts for nothing, besides his elementary task of defending the tribe. This feeling must always have been present. It has now awakened a bliss, and over above its earnestness, a huge security and joy." Now, here and elsewhere, Austrian writers echoed their German counterparts, the most famous or perhaps infamous example being Thomas Mann, whose 1914 essay, Thoughts in Wartime, Gedanken in der Kriege, argued that the resort to war was entirely justified, a tremendous creative event that would bring about national unity, moral elevation, and the values of genuine culture, as represented by Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, and Wagner, vis-a-vis the shallow civilization of a corrupt France and England. You read that over and over again in Mann and other people. We're the only people who have culture. The French have something called civilization, but that's pretty superficial. And the German and the English have nothing. I mean, the English is just a sort of, they don't understand what culture is, have no knowledge of it at all. America, of course, would not even be mentioned here. When in the late war years, artists and writers began to understand the very real horror of the Great War, they turned their attention from politics and culture to the ordeal of those who had actually fought in the trenches. Here, the most striking German work was Ernst Junger's The Storm of Steel of 1920, with its graphic account of frontline combat. By the time Erich Maria Remarque's pacifist All Quiet on the Western Front, Im Westen nichts Neues, was published in 1928, the mood had shifted completely. This book, says Remarque in a headnote to what was to become an international bestseller and a celebrated film, most of you will know the film, is to be neither an accusation nor a confession, and least of all an adventure, for death is not an adventure to those who stand face to face with it. It will simply tell of a generation of men who, even though they may have escaped shells, were destroyed by the war. But, and here things get complicated, Kraus's Last Days of Mankind has no more in common with All Quiet on the Western Front than with the odes or cartoons in praise of war of 1914. For whereas Junger or Remarque, or for that matter, the English war poets like Wilfred Owen or Siegfried Sassoon, wrote highly subjective and graphic accounts of warfare itself, bearing sympathetic witness to the ostensibly innocent young soldiers who were its victims, Kraus's documentary drama uses every device in its poetic arsenal to dramatize the complicity, cravenness, and often inadvertent cruelty not only of those who make war, but also of those who carry it out and remain behind. And that's what makes it such an unusual play. That's rarely treated with any kind of war work. It's usually about those at war. And we have plenty of work like Parade's End, for instance, British things, life in the trenches. But what about the people who are at home? And what about the politicians who are organizing it? From about how do they act? And that's what particularly interested Kraus. From the first shrill cry of the newsboy announcing the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand to the petty controversies between waiters and diners in local cafes, to the dispatches from the Ballhausplatz, the seat of the ministry, and the sermons preached in Vienna's churches, few, if any, are seen as exempt from the fevers and follies of war. What often begins as an accident rapidly turns into the status quo, revealing a latent viciousness that seems to permeate not only the public discourse, but the entire social fabric. High culture versus mere civilization. The dichotomy counts for little to the hungry children in the schoolroom, forced to recite patriotic pieties, we'll see that in a minute, or to bureaucrats in charge, or to the new recruits at military headquarters trying to bribe the petty bureaucrats in charge to give them a few hours of leave. Kraus's cruel apocalyptic vision may well have struck modernist readers as excessive. Unlike, say, Bertolt Brecht, he saw no political alternative to the capitalist competition that drove the war engine. If anyone was to blame for the cult of war, it was, in Kraus's view, not the economic system, but the press corps of which he himself was a member. Now, such obsession with the media will strike many of you as misconceived, or at least excessive. Walter Benjamin, a great admirer of Kraus, reminded readers that the newspaper is an instrument of power. It can derive its value only from the character of the power it serves. That was in 1931, shortly before the Nazis came to power. But by 1939, Benjamin is less sure about the dichotomy. Quote from Benjamin: "If it were the intention of the press to have the reader assimilate the information it supplies as part of its own experience, it would not achieve its purpose. But its intention is just the opposite, and it is achieved, to isolate events from the realm in which they could affect the experience of the reader. The principles of journalistic information, newness, brevity, clarity, and above all, lack of connection between the individual news items, contribute as much to this as the layout of the pages and the style of writing." Karl Kraus never tired of demonstrating the extent to which the linguistic habitus of newspapers paralyzes the imagination of the readers. That's from his long essay on Karl Kraus. Benjamin, in the collected writings, has a long, very important essay on Kraus. This assumes, of course, that there is in fact an individual imagination to undergo paralysis. But what happens when the media takes on a life of its own, as it has today, when the imagination is itself the product of mediation? The Last Days of Mankind is extraordinarily prescient about this situation, but until recently, critics have been slow to give the drama its due. Stanley Korngold's acute survey of World War I German literature, for example, that's in the Cambridge Companion to World War I, but in other places he says so too, mentions the play only in passing in discussing the theme of war profiteering as dramatized in some of its nasty satirical scenes. And even here, Korngold distanced himself from Kraus. Indeed, he cites him from a secondary source, referring to the author as a Jewish anti-Semite. If we had time, we can take that up a little later in the discussion. That's a very complicated issue. There's no doubt Kraus made anti-Semitic remarks. There's no doubt he was Jewish. He was converted briefly to Catholicism and then back again, but it was very much the temper of the time, in any case. The designation is not inaccurate, but it ignores the context of Kraus's invective. His argument about the making of World War I is that the public media, in their inevitable reliance on headlines, captions, and sound bites, create an atmosphere in which citizens no longer understand how barbaric and pointless a given policy may turn out to be. Patriotic pro-war Jewish editors and publishers, the signal example, and I'll show you his picture later, was Moritz Benedikt, who was the editor of the Neue Freie Presse, and who was Jewish. The whole press in Vienna was Jewish, which is one of the reasons that the countryside and the provincials hated Red Vienna so much later, thus came in for the same scathing critique as did their non-Jewish counterparts. After the war, and Last Days of Mankind was completed in 1922, such intramural battles gave way to more urgent problems. In the face of the violent anti-Semitism and conspiracy theories brought on by military defeat in 1918, Kraus turned his attention to the rise of National Socialism. Germany, he wrote in Die Fackel, as early as 1921, is the country, quote, where the swastika rises above the ruins of the global conflagration, 1921. Indeed, the Hakenkreuzler, swastiklers, were soon gaining steady ground. But then, as Edward Timms, who's Kraus's British biographer, points out, Kraus had predicted the post-war mood, whether fascist or communist, as early as 1915. The returning soldier will nevertheless not readily allow himself to be reintegrated into civilian life. He will break through into the home front and start the real war there. He will grab for himself the successes that have been denied him. And the war will be mere child's play by comparison with the peace that will break out there. May God protect us from the offensive that awaits us then. A terrible activity no longer constrained by any system of command will start wielding weapons and pursuing pleasures in every sphere of life, and more death and disease will come into the world than could ever have been contrived by the war itself. Whereas British World War I writing, again, the war poets and so on, is written from the perspective of the trenches themselves and hence foregrounds the victimhood of the hapless soldier, Kraus focused more broadly on the home front. Modern warfare, he wrote in Die Fackel, and this was in 1917, is no longer a matter of the crossbow and the tyrant, he's alluding to Schiller's Wilhelm Tell there, but rather technology and bureaucracy. As such, its principle of ghastly contrast, schauerliche Kontrasthaftigkeit, schauerliche Kontrasthaftigkeit is the phrase, demands a poetry characterized not by mathematical, but rather by what Kraus calls apocalyptic exactitude. Apocalyptic exactitude. The exactitude, we might say, of hyper-detail. It's a principle all too familiar to us in the age of information glut, and social networking. Paley Gritzer, young man from Israel who's getting a PhD at Harvard right now, contemplating current conceptualist writing, recently remarked, what literature can't do to our modern satisfaction by describing or evoking things of our world, it can do by taking into itself a large part of the stuff that's actually in the world, tax forms, chats, indices, letters, daily speech, radio jabber, emails, everything that's ever been on the internet, even literature itself. He's saying this in a discussion of the current spate of conceptual writing, conceptual poetry, and it comes right out of somebody like Kraus, because it's true that if you take the actual documents themselves, rather than try to imagine how did somebody feel who was on the battlefield, it becomes a very different thing. A century after its production, Kraus's hypertextual Last Days can best be understood as what I've elsewhere called a differential text, a text neither single nor autonomous, but rather a set of variants. Begun in 1915, given readings by its authors on numerous occasions throughout the war, and excerpted in Die Fackel, heavily revised in 1918, but not completed until 1922, and then not published in its complete form until 1926, Last Days has posed endless challenges for those editors and translators, as well as theater directors, who have wanted to reproduce it exactly as the author wrote it. How do you do that? Kraus himself knew it was impossible. The performance of this play, he announced in the preface to the 1926 edition, which according to terrestrial measurement of time would encompass about 10 evenings, is intended for theater on Mars, Marstheater. Theatergoers of this world would not be able to bear it, for it is the blood of their blood. The content is the narrative of those years, unreal, unthinkable, accessible to no waking sense or memory, only preserved in bloody dreams when the tragedy of mankind was played out as if by characters in an operetta. Kraus's unperformable drama in 5 acts, plus a prologue and an epilogue, runs to 800 pages. An abridged Bühnenfassung, that is a stage version, of 220 pages, made by Kraus himself, was produced in Vienna in 1928. The version eliminates the prologue and the epilogue, as well as the long debates between the two central characters who are called the optimist and the grumbler, der Nörgler in German, optimist and Nörgler, and reorders the sequence of scenes in the interest of narrative coherence and dramatic immediacy. But the result, to my mind, is that the multiplicity of registers that makes the original so striking has largely been lost. So there really is no way you can produce the whole play, and the whole question then becomes one of adaptation. Not surprisingly then, and that's why most of you don't know it, there's as yet no complete English translation of Die letzten Tage, although there's an admirable French one. With the advent of digital reproduction and YouTube, however, we're beginning to see a spate of performances and adaptations. From the recordings of Kraus's own readings of Die letzten Tage and related texts, and I'm going to show you, I'll show you this one right now, actually.
Eine Annonce.
That's Karl Kraus reading.
Nachtfelder Rundfahrten im Auto, veranstaltet durch die Basler Nachrichten. Reklamefahrten vom 25. September bis 25. Oktober zum ermäßigten Preis.
Now what he's reading here is this, Schlachtfelder Rundfahrten. Schlachtfelder Rundfahrten. Of the battlefields, and that is amazing. If you read it carefully, it's just hilarious. This was written in 1918, and you get a good hotel. You can stay in a first-class hotel, tour the battlefields in Belgium and northern France, and it's all a package deal. And you can see the corpses there, practically still on the battlefields. And there really was. I mean, this is a real thing. He didn't make this up. Verdun to Metz, see, there you can have your Schlacht, you can have your great trip, the round trip of the battlefields by automobile, which was a big thing still in those days, meals included. And if you think this is very exaggerated, think of some of the ads now for trips to the concentration camps, package deals and so forth. You know, we still do this kind of thing. So Kraus was just really looking at that. So that's one thing, and we'll hear other things by him. In 2000, there's a In 2004, for example, the La Mama Theater in New York produced an hour-long operetta version of The Last Days. I won't show you that, but it's interesting. And recent years have witnessed numerous films, videos, readings. Here, I will show you one. This is in Christchurch, New Zealand, performed just a couple of years ago. That's a really free adaptation. Done with masks, just to give you an idea. Here's a poster for a recent performance in Vienna, I think a very striking poster, 2012, just 2 years ago. And right now, I didn't know this, but I just read it in the TLS, right now there are two performances. There is Volkstheater and there's the Burgtheater. There are two performances, both of which come in for a lot of criticism. One of them cut out the two main characters completely, the kind of chorus. Another one turned them into sort of Jon Stewart, you know, kind of slapstick sort of thing, and the reviewer, anyway, haven't found them very satisfactory. There's a wonderful production, there was, by David Batchelor at the Glasgow Citizens Theatre in Edinburgh in 1999, and recorded for the BBC in December 1999, a 4-hour cabaret version set in a Viennese cafe, and that stars Giles Havergal, whom I happen to know is an actor who my other daughter Carrie has used in various plays at ACT, and he plays Giles the Grumbler. And I will actually play you a little bit of that. It begins, Ich habe nicht gewollt, which Kaiser Wilhelm said about the war. Ich habe es nicht gewollt. That's the last line of the play.
A performance of this play, which would, if computed into...
This is Kraus's preface. I'm just going to play you a snatch.
...is meant for a theatre on Mars. Earthly theatre-goers could not stand it, for it is blood of their blood, and its material comes from those unreal, unthinkable years, inaccessible to any memory, any waking consciousness, preserved only in a dream of blood, in which the tragedy of mankind was played out by figures in an operetta. The action, over 100 scenes and infer...
Now I want to show you the thing I found that was the best of the things done in recent years, which is not a play, a dramatic version, although I like the Edinburgh one very much, but it's pretty inaccessible. I'll come back to that. The reviewer, Leo Lensing, who reviewed in the TLS maybe 3 weeks ago, the Times Literary Supplement, the two plays that are on now, also reviewed this exhibition by Deborah Sengel, an artist I hadn't heard of, but I want to hear a lot more about her now, who did a brilliant installation, really brilliant, at the Sammlung Essel in Klosterneuburg, right outside Vienna. There's a catalog for it, but which is about €100, so I didn't get it, I just read about it. But I thought she absolutely caught the spirit of the play. Here's that opening scene with the newsboys, that's the cover of the whole thing, and here, that's Lord whoever, that Erzherzog sitting at the table trying to decide with his men what to do, what the campaign should be, what strategy they should use, and so on. So really very wonderful things. Just stay with that for a minute. So it obviously now is arousing everybody's imagination, and sooner or later we'll have more in English. There is, and that's the good news, Michael Russell, who's I've never met, a man in Ireland, has now done the complete translation in English, and it's online. And I can give you the connect to that online. You can just get it very easily by putting in The Last Days of Mankind, and he has published the epilogue as a separate little book, and the rest is online. And the way he solved the problem of the Austrian dialect, which is not an easy problem to solve, because it's all written really in slang, argot dialect, is to use Irish. So he sort of he transfers it to Joyce's Irish, and that works very well. In other words, you sort of recognize as you would the English, just the way you do the German with the various Austrian things. And I think on the whole, so I used his translation quite a bit, and he says it's going to be finished in 15 or 16 and then be published as a book. So we will finally have a good translation. The sad thing about that BBC version, that was a huge hit. When it was on in 1999, it got rave reviews in every newspaper. the Times, the Guardian, everywhere. But then it was on the, it was done 3 times and never done again. And I don't know how that happens or why, it could be done again. But therefore, and that was that was the cabaret adaptation played in the Viennese Cafe. I thought it was also with that voice you just heard, Giles Havergal, and other very good voices. Paul Schofield is in it. I think they did very well by it. So people have tried, but it still remains a kind of mystery. Okay, now next section, the metaphysics of sharks. Now how then does Kraussian theater actually work? My examples here will be mostly in the interest of time from Act 1, which begins with a great crowd scene on the eve of the war and moves from weighty discussions among titled diplomats to a hilarious scene in the Vienna suburbs in which a young construction crew is busy removing shop and restaurant signs bearing foreign names. So the Café Westminster, evidently frequented until the breakout of war by many British tourists, including lords of the realm, is saved only by becoming the Café Westminster. And the French adieu, then along with the Latin servus is the most common Austrian thing for goodbye, so long, servus, or hello too. The common Viennese idiom for so long and goodbye must be expunged from the vocabulary. The scene ends with the following speech by the first man. It's completely contorted. In the German, too. I'll read it to you in the English. You can look at the German. Apropos, in case someone protests, identify yourself simply as interimish volunteers of the Provisional Central Commission of the Executive Committee of the League for the General Boycott of Foreign Words. Addio. Now, the joke here is that this cautionary speech itself is a tissue of foreign phrases. Apropos, French, is followed by the Latin et protestiert and legimitiert, and then we get the mongrel Latin of interimistische, interimish, which also contains the paragram mist within it, trash. The word mist is in there. The final salutation, addio, is of course the Spanish counterpart of adieu, but Kraus's greatest irony is reserved for the compound general boycott, found in the absurdly pretentious title of the Provisional Central Commission of the Executive Committee. Boycott. The English word was coined during the Irish Land War of 1880 in response to the edict of Captain Charles C. Boycott, 1832 to 1897. If you look it up in the OED or on Wikipedia, you'll learn that. An English land agent in County Mayo who refused to lower his rents to please his tenant farmers. So the general boycott of foreign words is itself a foreign word. Indeed, a name derived from Austria's most powerful enemy, England. And just as boycott originated in one war, so it is now, the land war, the Irish Land War, it is now a practice in another one. Now, Kraus did not invent such absurdities. The Neue Freie Presse and other mainstream papers were full of them. In the next scene, an absurdist dialogue between teacher and pupils in a typical schoolroom takes place. Here, the word Fremdenverkehr, which you have in the third line there, literally traffic with foreigners, more broadly tourism, Fremdenverkehr, tourism, foreign exchange, foreign trade, whether commercial or sexual, metamorphoses to take on the term's opposite connotations, Verkehr, traffic in the form of war traffic, the exchange of tanks, trucks, appliances, planes, etc. Thus, the first stanza of the concluding alphabet song, 5 stanzas, one for each letter, A, E, I, O, U, sung by schoolboys and accompanied on the violin by their teacher, begins, and I always want to sing it, although I have no idea what the tune is, but it's sort of like, der Fremde, der ist da. Anyway, it rhymes, die Stirnzeiten sind vergangen, der Fremdenverkehr hat angefangen, der Fremde, der ist da. A, the foreigners, I translated these, the foreigner's on his way, the scrimping days have passed, there's foreign trade at last, A, the foreigner's on his way. Now, in the context of the little ballad, that which is foreign, which was studied as little as a week earlier, where everybody had to learn all about foreign countries, that's what you did at school, geography and so on, is turned overnight into the enemy. And the rest of the song celebrates Wiener Blut. The transformation of language and defeat of normal expectation is carried out at every level of the play. The brief scene 12, for example, contains the exchange between a giant in civilian dress and a dwarf in uniform. The giant has been rejected for military service. He declares he has slipped through the cracks, a delicious absurdity for a giant, whereas the dwarf is proud to have been called up. And we'll just read it in English. The dwarf. Well, I'm satisfied. A man who has a higher purpose grows taller. At first I feared I wouldn't fit into this great time and be capable of fighting shoulder to shoulder. But if you wear civilian clothes, you're made fun of. Whereas now that I'm in the military, I'll come back a hero, one over whose head many a cannonball has whizzed by. When the others throw themselves on the ground, I'll remain standing. The giant, you lucky one. Cheer up, it's not your fault. It all depends on the commission. The giant, I've slipped through the cracks. The dwarf, the physician noticed me. The giant, let's go eat, I have a gigantic appetite. The dwarf, yes, I could eat a little something. So the lucky dwarf, chosen for his ability not to be seen from a distance, which is obviously why they picked him, has won the right to die. War, the great equalizer, allows for such shifts in status. But the most dramatic of the early scenes, Act 1, Scene 14, is based on the actual case of a leading Viennese actress who, according to newspaper dispatches in 1916, happened to be performing in Riga in Russia when war broke out and was put under surveillance for possible spying by the Russian police. According to the Fremdenblatt, that newspaper, the police was suspicious because they found in the actress's possession a postcard from her brother, a young soldier who expressed how enthusiastic he was going to be to go to war against Serbia. Kraus evidently found this whole story suspect. In his version, the actress Elfriede Ritter is in the midst of unpacking in her nice Vienna apartment when three aggressive reporters, absurdly named Füchsel, little fox, Feigl, little fig, metaphorically little coward, and Halberstam, half a root or stem, turn up to interview her. Now, it's been said also those are Jewish names, and so it was also an attack on that. It probably is. One of them says Nebish at one point, but that's the takeoff of the press, the way the press was. Okay, Elfriede Ritter, speaking in North German accent, I'm smiling. Gentlemen, I'm most grateful for your heartfelt concern. It is really touching that my beloved Viennese still have such a regard for me. Yes, I would be glad to put off unpacking my suitcases, but with the best will in the world, gentlemen, I can't say anything except that it was very, very interesting, that nothing at all happened to me. Let's see, what else? That the journey home was certainly tedious, but in no way a hardship, and coyly, that I'm delighted to be back in my beloved Vienna. Immediately, the reporters pounce on this account, and Füchsel, who has already written the article's lead paragraph before the interview, declaims, freed from the horrors of Russian imprisonment and having finally reached the end of her tedious and difficult journey, one of Vienna's best-loved actresses wept tears of joy at the knowledge of being once more in her beloved city. Home. When the actress protests this interpretation, smiling and wagging her finger, the reporters insist she tell the truth so as to make clear that unlike in Russia, here in Vienna, there's freedom of speech. When Ritter recounts that she is telling the truth, that she was allowed to go everywhere and do whatever she liked, the reporters shift to a new strategy, mentioning seemingly quite casually that her theater's director, one Fuchs, has a special animus toward Russia, and reminding Fräulein Ritter how well she's always been treated in the Vienna theater. In the future, they suggest pointedly, choice acting parts may not really be offered to her. Your whole career could be at stake. Before we know it, the actress is backing down and telling her dear reporter friends, liebe Doktorchen, she calls them, that she can't quite remember what happened and that perhaps she's just blocking certain painful memories. When Füchsel now suggests that the actress is too intimidated to talk about what really happened, Ritter plays along. Having gotten his story of the abuse Elfriede Ritter supposedly suffered, Füchsel, Feigl, and Halberstam prepare for their speedy departure. And now it is the actress who flatters them. It was so lovely of you to come to see me. Come again soon. As the three reporters go out the door, Feigl tells his friends, see, she went through all those terrible things and didn't have the courage to tell anyone. In the end, the journalists believe, or at least claim to believe, their own story. Ritter did, after all, refer to her most secret feelings toward the end, meine geheimsten Empfindungen, and she said, well, maybe I had some kind of emotional trauma that I can't quite remember. But of course, nothing happened to her at all, but that's the way the newspaper is going to want it to look. All the truth that's fit to print. Kraus's vicious little story, perhaps based, I think this scene must have been based on the scene of Queen Anne's transformation in Shakespeare's Richard III. You remember the famous scene with Queen Anne where the queen totally turns around when she realizes it's in her best interest, has become paradigmatic. We never see Elfriede Ritter again because this is a play, it's metonymic, it's more like a film where one thing happens, another thing happens. It isn't that there's a unifying plot where you meet the characters again, most of the time anyway. In Act 1, Scene 24, we witness the court photographer, and this is very funny, and was based on an actual drawing of the day. And this drawing shows you, the German, here is the Count Konrad von Hötzendorf with his adjutant behind him, looking at the map of the Italian front where he's supposed to be getting the battle ready, and it turns out he's looking at a map of the Balkans from 10 years earlier. Because he had a success in the Balkans, but now he's pretty old and he sort of has had it. And everybody knew that. That was a well-known story, and this was a well-known sort of drawing cartoon. So in 124, we witnessed the court photographer Skolik preparing to take a picture of Field Marshal Konrad von Hötzendorf as the latter is perusing this map. And in this scene, I won't play that whole scene now, the photographer soon notes that the senile old field marshal is confusing the map in front of him and is looking at the one of the Balkans, and he doesn't say anything, and then the field marshal wants him to take his picture, so he takes a sort of headshot and lets it go. But there are many scenes like this in the play where the generals, the military in general, but also the politicians at home have everything backwards, and no wonder they can't win the battles and so on. This is the way it goes. In Act 1, Scene 26, the well-known super-patriotic war correspondent, and this is a woman, Alice Schalek, she was very famous, called in the play by her real name, delivers her first eyewitness report from the front. Up on the mountain pass, she writes, I felt something like satisfaction for the first time. A Dolomite hotel metamorphosed into military accommodation. Isn't that wonderful that a good hotel became a military accommodation? Where are they now, those over-made-up, lace-bedecked signoritas? That Italian hotelier vanished into thin air. And then there's a takeoff of Moritz Benedict. Here he is. That's the hated editor whom Kraus, I think, wrote too much about. You know, you can hate too much, too, of the Neue Freie Presse, but let's say his worst enemy. And the scene for him, I will give you a snatch of, and it goes like this. This is supposed to be about Austria's naval success in the Adriatic, one of the battles in the Adriatic. And the fish, lobsters, and spider crabs of the Adriatic have not had such good times in a long while. In the southern Adriatic, they dined on almost the entire crew of the Leon Gambetta. In the mid-Adriatic, they found sustenance in the Italians of the MV Turbine. In the northern Adriatic, an even more bountiful table was laid for the denizens of the deep. Now, of course, Moritz Benedict didn't actually write that, but he wrote things that could be made turned that way, and so Kraus will parody those things and put them in. No folly, no mendacity is exempt from Kraus's gaze. Consider Act 534, and here I'm going to play a whole scene. And this is a short scene in which a woman from the village of Postabitz is writing a letter to her husband at the front. Now, in what you're going to hear, it is read. We have a man in this film clip reading her actual letter. It's sometimes done differently. Ignatia takes the perspective of the soldier husband getting his wife's letter at the front, but in other versions, it can be treated a little bit differently. Now, I'm going to play it for you in German, but then I'll show you the English. And this was a video I just happened to find online that was put on that uses pre-Raphaelite imagery.
Szene. Im Dorfe Postabitz. Eine Frau sitzt an einem Tisch und schreibt: Innigst geliebter Gatte, ich teile dir mit, dass ich mich verfehlt habe. Ich kann nichts dafür, lieber Gatte. Du verzeihst mir schon alles, was ich dir mitteile. Ich bin in Hoffnung geraten von einem anderen. Ich weiß ja, dass du gut bist und mir alles verzeihst. Er hat mich überredet und sagte, du kommst so nicht mehr zurück vom Felde, und hatte dazu meine schwache Stunde. Du kennst ja die weibliche Schwäche und kannst nichts Besseres als verzeihen. Es ist schon passiert. Ich dachte mir schon, dir muss auch schon was passiert sein, weil du schon 3 Monate nichts mehr geschrieben hast. Ich bin ganz erschrocken, als ich deinen Brief erhalten habe und du noch am Leben warst. Ich wünsche es dir, aber verzeih es mir, lieber Franz. Vielleicht stirbt das Kind und dann ist alles wieder gut. Ich mag diesen Kerl nicht mehr, weil ich weiß, dass du noch am Leben bist. Bei uns ist alles sehr teuer, es ist gut, dass du fort bist. Im Feld kostet dich wenigstens das Essen nichts. Das Geld, was du mir geschickt hast, kann ich sehr notwendig gebrauchen. Es grüßt dich nochmals deine dir unvergessliche Frau, Anna.
And now here it is in English. And there are a lot of misspellings in the German text. And I was going to translate it and misspell it, but it doesn't seem to have too much point. It wouldn't work quite the same way. But it is purposely not quite right. Dearly loved husband, I write to tell you that I've gone wrong. I can't do nothing about it, dearest husband. You must forgive me everything I'm writing to tell you. I'm expecting, and by somebody, someone else. I know, though, you're a good man and will forgive me everything. He talked me into it and said you would not be coming back from the front. And that's why I had a weak moment. You know women's weaknesses, and there's nothing to be done except to forgive me. Forgive me. It's already happened. I thought to myself, too, something must have happened to you when you hadn't written to me in 3 months already. I was frightened off my feet when I got your letter, and you're still alive. I'm glad you are, but forgive me, dear Franz. Maybe the kid will die, and then everything will be all right again. Like that. Charming, right? I don't like the guy anymore because I know you're still alive. Here, everything is very pricey. It is good you're away. At the front, at least, you get food for nothing. The money you sent me will come in very handy. Greetings again to you from your, it actually is not unforgettable, but your unforgetting wife. It's not quite right, your wife, Anna. Now, this Kraus shows us, and I think the video does it very well, although I don't know about how you feel about the illustrations and the lovely images of elegantly dressed Victorian maidens. This is what the unnatural separation of war does to ordinary people. The final turn with its hope that the baby might die and its choice of Franz's money over the other man's, quote, love, makes for painfully ironic reading. The individual is at the mercy of a chain of events whose import, thanks to the daily news, is fueled by nothing so much as hearsay, false alarm, and especially rumor. One of the great moments in Last Days is the scene in Act 5, scene 17, based on Kraus's own piece, this was the thing you had on the poster, of Die Fackel, which was a cartoon by Rudolf Herrmann and reprinted in Fackel's Weltgericht, called Die Gerüchte. And then there's another version of it in the play. But first I'll play you this and then come back to it. This is the way it is in Die Fackel, and then it was done later and read. I found this on. Yeah. Now just notice just all the repetition of the word Gerüchte, rumor.
In Wien waren Gerüchte verbreitet, dass in ganz Österreich Gerüchte verbreitet seien, es seien in Wien Gerüchte verbreitet. Mehr wurde über das Wesen der Gerüchte nicht gesagt, als dass das Wesen der Gerüchte eben darin bestehe, dass man es nicht sagen könne. Man war nur auf Gerüchte angewiesen, um überhaupt herauszubekommen, was es für Gerüchte eigentlich seien.
Okay, I'll stop at that. And here's the comparable scene in the play, which I'll have for you in English. The dialogue between the subscriber and the patriot. What about the rumors? I'm worried. The rumor going around in Vienna is that there are rumors going around in Austria. Patriot, nobody knows anything specific, but there must be something to it if even the government announces that there are rumors. Subscriber, the government specifically warns against believing rumors or spreading them. Well, I do what I can everywhere I go. I say, who pays any attention to rumors? Well, it wouldn't be so bad if it was just rumors about rumors being rumors. But the government is announcing it for a fact. Subscriber, well, then there must be something to it. But who pays any attention to rumor? Precisely. The government is saying that the rumors are part of an enemy attempt to shake our loyalty and sow the seed of confusion among us. subscriber. Well, of course, but that's only a rumor. Where's my train? And it goes on in that vein. So, this kind of scene. Now, and so it goes, modulating through some 30 repetitions of the word Gerüchte, the power of rumor to determine what happens, becoming stronger and stronger, the more each character denies their validity or even their very existence. And incidentally, these are all just YouTubes you can pick up just by putting a few words on YouTube. In the scene that follows Die Gerüchte, the optimist and the grumbler, Kraus's two core characters, pick up the thread, the former asking the latter, "What do you say about the rumors then?" Retrospectively, the entire play has dramatized the work of rumor, hearsay, tip-off, expose, until there's nothing outside it anymore. Now, I've left to last a consideration of the play's two central characters who aren't based on quotations, or some of their dialogues are, but some aren't, the optimist and the grumbler. Most readers have taken the grumbler to be Kraus himself, his mouthpiece, the source of the drama's key ideas about politics, history, culture, and war. But in his 1928 stage version, Kraus eliminated the two completely, evidently sensing that their dialogues, however interesting ideologically, were not sufficiently theatrical. Edward Timms contends that we must be cautious to equate the grumbler with Kraus, given that the latter's politics evolved as he was writing the play from the early allegiance to the monarchy to a later radical socialism toward the end of his life. The grumbler, Timms argues, may be defined as a simplified version of Kraus's satirical self. He is most significant as a character in a play, not as a mirror image of the author. And by the same token, the optimist is less an allegorical figure than the naive interlocutor of Platonic dialogue, the interlocutor who feeds Socrates his cues. It's a type made familiar by Diderot in Le Neveu de Rameau, and again, that was probably a kind of prototype for Kraus. That said, it's hard to deny that many of the long scenes between optimist and grumbler don't become tiresome. They do, and undercut the dramatic momentum of Kraus's play. I did find myself flagging there. These go on, and they're too topical. I think they do have to be cut, in part. True, the grumbler speeches contain some of Kraus's best aphorisms. In response to the optimist's early hope that the war has inspired a spirit of self-sacrifice, in Act 1, Scene 22, the grumbler quips, "If you have to set fire to a house just to find out whether 2 decent tenants will come to the rescue of 10 tenants, while 88 shady tenants seize the opportunity to do something underhanded, then it would be a mistake to delay the work of the fire brigade and police with eulogies on the goodness of human nature." And further along in the same scene, when the optimist proposes that modern medicine has succeeded in preventing the spread of typhus, cholera, and the plague, the grumbler responds, "Is it an argument in favor of war that war has provided the opportunity of making some small progress in coping with its attendant phenomena? Shame on a science that takes pride in its ingenuity in making artificial arms and legs, but lacks instead the power to prevent altogether, and as a matter of principle, the splintering of the bones in the first place," which is interesting. Now, embedded as so many are in long speeches, Kraus's aphorisms sometimes lose their punch. Indeed, in its 800-page version, The Last Days of Mankind inevitably has tedious moments. But as diagnosis of the role the media played in the evolution of the World War, and by implication in later wars, Kraus's dramatic satire is unique. Journalism, wrote Walter Benjamin in his essay on Kraus, is betrayal of the literary life, of mind of the demon. Idle chatter is its true substance, and every feuilleton poses anew the insoluble questions of the relationship between the forces of stupidity and malice, whose expression is gossip. The twins, gossip and rumor, animated Kraus's world, and they are ones we of the 21st century know only too well. If you say it on Twitter, it must be so at least for 10 seconds. The next message comes in. Well, just to conclude now, if human beings had no cliches, Kraus remarked in his 1921 essay on the theory of language, they wouldn't need any weapons. Let me conclude with a remarkable dialogue that illustrates the point nicely. In Act 1, Scene 25, we meet 2 soldiers, one German and one Austrian. In this reading, and
Ein deutscher und ein österreichischer Soldat,
anyway, you'll see in a
Schulter an Schulter treten auf.
You have 2 characters.
Wachtmeister Wagenknecht. Da sind wir denn alle angetreten und unser Oberbombenwerfer sagte, Jungens, wenn ihr jetzt mal Lust habt, immer feste drauf. Feldwebel Sedlacek, sich ganz nah an ihn haltend und erschreckt zu ihm emporblickend. Geh, Wagenknecht, erlaube mal, Du lehnst ja an
Anyway, I'll just leave the picture on, but it's a wonderful, very clever scene. The German is named Wachmeister, Master Sentinel, Wagenknecht, a typical Prussian name, surname meaning driver, Wagenknecht, driving the wagon, the truck. The Austrian is Feldwebel, sergeant, Sedlacek, diminutive of Sedlak, Czech for peasant. So the Austrian is a stupid little peasant, and the German is, much more experienced. Wagenknecht tells Sedlacek that they have orders from above, from the Oberbombenwerfer, the bomb thrower, the head bomb thrower, to release some bombs. Sedlacek is very reluctant to get involved in any actual fighting, voices his confusion about the prefix over, and they discuss that prefix for about a page, remarking that since bombs fall down, not up, they fall herab, why is it called the Oberbombenwerfer? And then the German responds that this is so because Oberbombenwerfer is formed on the analogy of Oberkellner, the head waiter, Oberkellner. So that's why it works that way, whom one often just calls Ober. If you call him over, you say, hey, Ober, For short, everyone recognizing that the reference is to the waiter in charge. A bit of bickering about the use of the word Ober ensues, and before we know it, the Austrian asks if it's okay for him to drop a few bombs now. He's persuaded. Wagenknecht, having won the verbal victory with his absurd analogies, responds, na meinetwegen, wenn es dir Spaß macht, sure, for all I care, if you enjoy it. And he quickly exits from the plane, leaving the Austrian peasant soldier, who seems to have no inkling of what's going on, to do the job. The reluctant recruit, whose main concern at the start of the scene was to keep the overbearing German from pressing against his shoulders, is now claiming the title. And that title contains a further irony. Oberbombenwerfer, there's a very good little dictionary to the things in the book by a woman named Eva Pistorius, was the epithet given in the press to the German Crown Prince Wilhelm. Kraus is here playing once again on newspaper dispatches so as to demonstrate that truth, at least certain local truths, can be stranger than fiction. Even the newspaper, Walter Benjamin says of Kraus's art, is quotable. And Benjamin continues, part of his essay, the quotation summons the word by its name, wrenches it destructively from its context, but precisely thereby calls it back to its origin. As rhyme, it gathers the similar into its aura. As name, it stands alone and expressionless. In citation, the two realms of origin and destruction justify themselves before language. And as language goes, Kraus was convinced, so goes the nation. The satiric thrust of last days is less dependent on plot or character, indeed seasons can easily be reordered or reconfigured, than on its unmasking of the particular language games emerging from the war archive, the everyday dispatches from the city or the battlefield, always already mediated and rechanneled. In this great time, or is it a small time, it is the weaponry of cliché that ruled, and I gave you a few examples here. So, like Oberbombenwerfer. And Edward Tim said, what a dehumanizing effect such compounds as these had. Menschenmaterial, human material. Verteidigung, these were all compounds that came into being at the time of the war. Verteidigungskrieg, defensive warfare. Verteidigungskrieg, Schutzhaft, protective custody, and Schicksal, Gemeinschaft, communal destiny, compounds that intentionally obscure the horrors of war. And his greatest animus in the immediate post-war period was reserved for the word Hakenkreuz, literally hooked cross, this swastika, the symbol adopted as its emblem by Hitler's fledgling Nazi party as early as 1920. How, Kraus asks, could the Christian cross, emblem of religious contemplation, coexist with the hook, an implement for cutting and hacking? When words transmit such contradictory messages simultaneously, there's sure to be something suspicious and sinister. And it's incidentally interesting, I looked this up just because I was curious what the word swastika, which of course is our word, what the etymology of the word swastika is, which is quite different from Hakenkreuz. So somebody could work on that and figure this out. In any case, let's see if I can find it here. Yeah, the word swastika from the Sanskrit, svastika, designates an equilateral cross with four arms bent at 90 degrees. It dates back to ancient civilization, both in the Mediterranean world as well as in China and India. The word swastika comes from the Sanskrit, su meaning good or auspicious, asti meaning to be, and ka as a suffix. So the swastika literally means to be good. But it's interesting that the Hakenkreuz, which we then didn't translate that way, has those very opposite kind of meaning. Language for Kraus thus has a strong ethical component. He would have approved of Ezra Pound's dictum that good writers are those who keep the language efficient. If a national literature declines, the nation atrophies and decays. In Kraus's later years, the cleansing of language became something of an obsession. In the 1932 Fackel essay Die Sprache, the language, for example, he declares that to confront the riddles of language's rules, the scenes of its dangers, is a mania more admirable than the madness that thinks it can control language. And in his fascination with linguistic puzzles, like the famed duck-rabbit that Wittgenstein then used, is it a duck or is it a rabbit, that drawing, Kraus has been said to anticipate the Wittgenstein of the philosophical investigations, whose propositions were gradually being formulated in the early 1930s. In 1932, the year Kraus published the Fackel essay I just cited, Wittgenstein was lecturing at Cambridge on what he called the puzzles of language. But unlike Kraus, this Wittgenstein takes language as he finds it without making the slightest value judgment as to the ethical component of this or that word or phrase. The aim, on the contrary, is to describe and understand what is, to understand what a given proposition might mean in its given context. There are no gaps in grammar. Grammar is always complete. And again, grammatical rules are arbitrary, but their application is not. All applications take place inside of language. Accordingly, and here we come to the cornerstone of Wittgenstein's investigation, the meaning of a word is its use in the language. And to accept this axiom is also to accept its corollary that ordinary language is all right. Kraus's own language theory, coming as it does out of an earlier epoch, could not allow for such Gelassenheit, such letting be, let's say. Ordinary language for him was certainly revelatory, but that didn't mean it was all right. For him, words are still viewed as the carriers of specific cultural political import. It is words, especially coinages like Hakenkreuz or Oberbombenwerfer, that measure that culture's values. But what makes Kraus so modern, or we should say postmodern really, is his understanding in a work like Die letzten Tage der Menschheit, of the role that found text could play in the new world of media, a world he had so thoroughly mastered. One may, as one reads Kraus's apocalyptic superdrama, with its wild mix of genres and visual sonic hyperbole, disagree with any numbers of statements his characters, even the optimist and the pessimist, make. Again, one may find the play's author too pessimistic, too cynical, but the sense of immediacy and accuracy in scenes that put the reader-viewer in the position of both witness and accessory makes The Last Days of Mankind a docudrama whose time, a century later, I think has certainly come. Thank you.
There, one, yeah.
I just want to say thank you for coming today. I really enjoyed your speech and your lecture. Do you think The Last Days could be made into a movie with everything available in Hollywood today?
Actually, I think in a certain way it could, because it satirizes everything. Nobody's really quite immune from it, including the author in a way. But it wouldn't be, because it would, well, you're right, it probably wouldn't, but I certainly could see it. I thought you were going to say, could it be a film, or could it be a docudrama? I think one thing it really could be is done on TV, or done as a video, and then you could splice different things and have different scenes. I take it you don't think it could be made. No, I suppose not, because Hollywood would be considered guilty of all the things. And notice, that's one reason I wanted to play you that whole scene. I wanted to play you that whole scene by the pregnant, the woman who thinks, oh good, maybe the baby will die. We tend, the reason I am so gun-shy is not a good word, why I have a hard time with most war poetry and most war films, is the victims are always innocent, they're always good people. You know, we just automatically sort of assume that because they are the victims. Victims must always be wonderful. And so, you know, the emphasis is on the others. But one of Kraus's great things, and I think this was true in this literature in general, and of course there are plenty of other literature in which it's true, is the victims, just because somebody's a victim doesn't make them a terrific person, or even a good person. You know, people are victimized for all kinds of reasons. That doesn't mean they're all sitting there being virtuous and doing the right thing. And so I think it's very important to show those scenes and show that, well, you know, you can blame society, you can blame education, whatever you want to blame, or you can just say it's original sin, whatever you want. But the fact is the woman left behind is not just a little sweetie, as she would be presented in Hollywood, where of course she would be, waiting forever for her husband to come back, but only 3 months have gone by and already she's pregnant by somebody else, because she thought Franz wasn't coming back. But when he comes back, he's got more money and is better than the other guy. So then she said, ich liebe doch diesen anderen Kerl, and I don't even like the other guy. And that is very cynical. Of course, it's a very cynical thing. And yeah, Hollywood, I guess, I'll switch my answer and say no. I guess in Hollywood, in Hollywood it wouldn't, but after all, there are other films made. There are films made, by Indies maybe, that it would be possible. I doubt it very much because there is the sacred thing in Hollywood and in our culture that the victim is always somehow a good person and innocent. Victims are innocent.
Other question here.
Hi, thank you very much for your lecture. I really enjoyed it. You spoke a lot about the role of language games and the found texts of the archives and how, I suppose, language was played with during the war, invented and coined and transformed during the war. I wonder, does Kraus, either in this play or in his other works...
I can't quite understand.
Sorry, I wonder, does Kraus, either in this play or in other works, talk about the peculiarly multilingual nature of Austria-Hungary's war and the fact that there was so much multilingual propaganda and they had to address audiences?
Sorry, I can't, for some reason I can't understand you really. Yeah. Can somebody summarize that? The what? Oh, absolutely.
So does he address that? Yeah.
Absolutely. I have other chapters on that. The interesting thing is that Austria before the war was polyglot. There are very interesting statistics in that. Even in the Austrian part, the small part I showed on the map, only about half the people spoke German. My grandfather, who was a minister in the Austrian government, had the person who was in charge of him, who then, of course, suddenly left in 1918, when there was the new Czechoslovakia, was a Czech. There were loads of Czechs in the Austrian government who mainly spoke Czech. In the parliament itself, people made speeches in Czech, Hungarian, and Slavic. They're all the different languages, and there's a kind of feeling for the different languages. And until actually war broke out, there was therefore, I would say in a curious way, a much more live and let live and more respect than there was after. The terrible anti-Semitism comes after the war, when Austria was all German and wanted Anschluss, and Woodrow Wilson wouldn't let it be annexed, and it was all German speaking. That's when the really bad part began. And Kraus sort of saw that coming. And then the politics got so bad. But he had the view then, as many people now do, and I talk about this, it's really all one war. I mean, you get kind of, as you go from 1914, there are only 20 years between, and before you know it, it's all already there. And I think Kraus was amazing that in 1914, he could see how disastrous and how crazy it was to go to war. One of the reasons he shows all those characters like Sedlacek, again, they're the Slavic, the kind of peasant, and the dialect they all speak is people were so unprepared for war, they didn't know what they were doing, who they were for or what. And you don't usually read that, because when you read about the war, it's always the Germans versus the English and French, and the Austrian Empire, where after all it began, is left behind because it was considered so backward that it wasn't given in the exhibition. There are a few Austrian things, but of course it's always Germany's war. But the interesting thing was that I do think, the more I study it, that Austria in a curious way was really the greatest victim, because it was so destroyed that there was nothing that could happen. And if you read the things that happened in 1918, when the country was suddenly divided, and I do mean suddenly, they thought they won on the Eastern Front. On the Eastern Front, the Germans, after all, won. Then the Americans came along, and the next thing you know, the war was over, and they lost. And what happened was that in Austria, there was literally nothing to eat, because the food used to come from Hungary and from Yugoslavia. That was the breadbasket, and now there was no food coming in. There was no fuel coming in, which used to come from Czechoslovakia, coal and oil. So when all those places were cut off and hated, now, of course, we're independent countries, so they weren't going to do anything for Austria, there was literally nothing to eat. There are very good descriptions of that in, say, Stefan Zweig's memoir, where he describes how people who had cats and dogs better watch out, because you leave them loose and they'll be gone very soon, because people ate cats and dogs because there just was nothing to eat. So when you think of what that situation was like, it's just horrible beyond words. And also he shows it throughout the play getting worse and worse. The silly scenes occur more near the beginning. Toward the end, you get these very dramatic scenes and apocalyptic scenes in the epilogue, and it's a little much, in a way. It couldn't really be produced, the whole thing, but it's very interesting to read, and I hope some of you will, look at some of these scenes that you can now see. Yeah.
That's one more.
Yeah, I just have a question. I'm wondering, do you think that there's a Kraus out there now looking in at our civilization and our newspapers, a la rumor and, what was it, rumor and, what was the other word? I can't.
Maybe.
Pardon me?
Could be. What,
Yeah, I don't
somebody's
know.
looking in on. Well,
What
I do
would you
think it
think?
will be looked at very differently later, and we're just sort of crying to have, really. I mean, you do get good parodies. You get some good parodies of certain things, but you certainly often get parodies of the military. You get parodies of the politicians. But as I say, until you can also get parodies of the common people in a way, I don't think they work as well. Because it isn't that the others are noble and wouldn't go to war. They're very happy to go along with it. There's some terrifying scenes where middle-level people, middle-class people, are willing to get, in order to get a commission, will bribe somebody, and bribery becomes the main way of operating. And you can't blame them all. I mean, they're all just trying to survive, in part. So you can say, and it is Brechtian in that way. I mean, I think Brecht learned a lot, actually, from Kraus. That kind of nastiness and cynicism, but it's not an American mood to do that, I think. And whether anybody's looking at our civilization and going to do it, I don't know. I just don't know.
Okay, last
Our
question.
civilization is
Atop.
bad.
Oh, hi. I was wondering in your book if you're going to, when you're severing formal innovation from the avant-garde, when you sever formal innovation from the avant-garde, are you going to develop an argument for a new understanding of the avant-garde through these works? Are you, in your book, explicate that a little bit more? Or?
Would what's the question?
When you began the lecture...
when I began?
You began the lecture by severing formal innovation from the avant-garde to argue that this is also avant-garde. Will you be explicating that more in your book about?
Yes, I do it.
And so
what I mean is that for years, I wrote The Futurist Moment, where I wrote the avant-garde and talk about all the avant-garde techniques. I still believe that. I mean, I love both the Italian and the Russian avant-garde, but and modernism. Maybe it's more, avant-garde and modernism are two terms that shade into each other anyway. But these writers have often not been talked about. The others, Musil, even Kafka, have not usually been talked about as avant-garde and not grouped and not studied ever by people. So let's say if you are Austrian, you're going to study Jandl, they're later people. I am going to a conference on the avant-garde in Vienna, so I'll see what they do. It then leads to a much more fragmented and radical avant-garde in a way. These writers aren't avant-garde technically, but in a funny way, I think they speak to our own time, perhaps more than some of the avant-garde works do, because it's the irony. It's a kind of irony that it's not satire so much. Satire always has a norm. If you have satire, there's a norm against which you measure the object being satirized, so you have norms. But this is a satire that really almost has no norm, because it's not clear really what should have happened or what could have happened, and that's true in Musil's Man Without Qualities, where there really are no solutions. All you can do is ask questions, but there aren't going to be solutions. And I came across an amazing thing by Kraus, when in the early 20s, when in Germany, when communism started to be big, and after all it was supposed to happen in Germany, not in Russia, and a lot of the communists were Jews, and there was all the friction about that. Kraus said, and this I think is as early as it was in the late 20s. I'm sorry. It was shortly before, he died in 36. It was in 1931, but it's interesting that he said, or maybe 30. He said, if people don't watch out, before there's a revolution, before the revolution comes, there will be a pogrom. And there was, so, I mean, it's amazing to me that actually did happen that way. In other words, he thought that since so many of it wasn't really true that all the Jews were communists by any means, and the biggest capitalists, many of them were Jews too, but because so many communists were and were perceived as being, that the idea would be that before there's going to be any kind of Marxist revolution, there's going to be a pogrom, and you could argue that, very soon, in a sense, that is what happened. So he was very prescient, but on the other hand, he had no solution. He didn't believe that the economic solution would work, and that's very characteristic of the Austrians. They're kind of skeptical and cynical in the end, and I shouldn't just call it the Austrians, all these writers pretty much that I talk about in the book are Jewish, except for Musil, whose wife was Jewish, and who was also an outsider. They were all outsiders. They were mostly from the provinces, not directly from Vienna. So it's a kind of outsider view that is cynical without having solutions. There are no solutions. And by the way, these people all loved the French. If there's anybody they loved, it wasn't the Germans. It was the French. France was the desirable country, the land of light. So there was so much Francophilia. Celan, when he, from Czernowitz, was going to medical school in Tours, so he had to cross Germany on the train. He never says anything about that. And he had no particular interest in Germany. He was interested in France. He was interested in the French poets and so on. So there was a feeling that France had had a revolution, and that it was, in a way, the country that many of these people admired. Kraus, too. Yeah.
Please join me again in thanking Professor Perloff for a wonderful talk, very inspiring.